in the bedrooms on either side of the hallway that was separated by a staircase. But that staircase was now engulfed in flames. So George quickly ran to the side of the house where they kept the ladder, hoping to get into the kids' bedrooms upstairs. But somehow, some way, this ladder that they always kept by the side of their house was missing. And so he thought that he could just drive one of his two coal trucks to the house and try to climb and reach the windows. But even though they were working and running perfectly the day before, neither of them would start now. What's up, everybody? Yo, welcome back to my channel. Hey, I appreciate you guys' faces, and as usual, I understand how valuable time is, so hopefully I don't waste you guys' time with this one. So what I do here is that I just simply regurgitate stories that I come across via books, web, that's about it, I guess, or something that I know I can verify. If I hear it, I verify, but oh well. So we've heard of kidnappings, we've heard of mysterious disappearances. We can't explain. Some are folklore, ghost, mob hits. But this story is particularly interesting because of how everything transpired. Now, this case still has not been solved, and it will never be solved, just given the time that this happened and how everything unfolded. At the end, or now, if you like this type of content or this future content, please like, comment, subscribe, notification bell, all that helps. And with that being said, let's just jump straight into this video. For more than 40 years, the mysterious disappearance of 5 young children plagued the city of Fayetteville, West Virginia. Now, driving along Route 16, you could see a billboard with gritty images of 5 children, all dark-haired, salmon-colored eyes, with their names and their ages attached. Maurice was 14, Martha was 12, Louis was 9, Jenny was 8, and Betty was 5. Now, rumors always played a larger role, more so than the evidence in this case, because no one could ever agree whether the kids were dead or alive. But what everyone knew for certain was that on the night before Christmas, 1945, George and Jenny Sodder, along with 9 of their children, went to sleep, and around 1 a.m. a fire broke out. George, Jenny, and 4 other children would survive, but the other 5 were unaccounted for. Now, George Sodder was born in Italy in 1985. He later immigrated to the U.S. in 1908, where he would find work on the railroads in Pennsylvania, carrying water and other supplies to and from other workers. And a few years would go by, he would start his own trucking company, first hauling dirt to construction sites and then later hauling coal that was mined in that region. And so one day he walks into a local store called the Music Box, and he met the owner's daughter, Jenny Cipriani. Now, Jenny and George instantly connected due to both of them immigrating over here from Italy, even though Jenny immigrated when she was 3 years old with her family. But nevertheless, and needless to say, they became a couple and later settled in Fayetteville, West Virginia. Now, when they got there, they would have 10 kids, all between the years of 1923 and 1943. Now, Fayetteville was attractive because it was old-fashioned and it had a small but active immigrant community. And it was once said that the Sodder family had become one of the most well-respected middle-class families around. Now, even though George held strong beliefs and opinions about everything, I mean, like everything from business, current events, politics, war, you name it, but for some reason, he was reluctant to talk about his youth and what actually made him leave Italy. But, however, George never shied away from the topic of the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini and his dislike for him, going so far as to getting into strong arguments with other members in his community. And knowing that this was a strong, old-fashioned community, one could understand the conflicting arguments and views when it comes to Mussolini. Now, Mussolini was a socialist turned fascist. He was once a journalist turned cold-blooded politician. He was a warmonger, and in so many ways, ruthless. Like check this out. After getting kicked out of the Italian Socialist Party and support for the Italian military participation in World War I, he goes on to start the Italian fascist movement in 1919 and then quickly rose to power. And even though he won the election to the Italian Chamber of Deputies in 1921, he and his black shirt supporters led the March on Rome, where he seized the power and position of prime minister. And as crazy as that sounds, he wasn't reprimanded, nor was he removed from power, but instead he was invited by King Victor Emmanuel III to start or help form a new government. And it was also said that he and Hitler didn't really like each other, but due to their nationalistic ambitions, they had an alliance, or they formed an alliance called the Pact of Steel, which committed themselves and their military in the economical efforts of war. Now, most people would say Mussolini's a bad guy, but depending on who you ask, they may have a different point of view. But the only reason why I say that is because that is part of many conspiracies that surrounds this case. So, in October 1945, just 2 years after their last child was born, George was visited by a life insurance salesman. And when George declined the salesman's offer, the salesman warned George that his house would go up in smoke and his kids would be destroyed because of his dirty remarks about Mussolini. Now, George knew he didn't like Mussolini and he disagreed with him in his actions, and thought about his occasional debates with other members in his community. And though they would have heated and very passionate arguments and debates, none of them warranted this type of response. So at this time, George didn't take this man's threat seriously. And not long after this incident, another man visited the home seemingly looking for work and warned George that a pair of his fuse boxes would cause a fire someday. And at that point, George was puzzled because he had just had the local electric company come check the wiring because he had just had his electric stove installed, and they told him that everything was safe. Now, in the weeks before Christmas that year, George's oldest sons noticed a strange car parked along the main highway, and whoever was in the car, they were watching the younger Sutter children as they returned home from school. Christmas Eve 1945, the older sister Marion comes home from work and she surprises her younger sisters Martha, Jenny, and Betty with new toys. And as excited as they were, they asked and they begged their mother if they could stay up late, and Jenny told them that they could stay up late as long as the two older boys who were awake at the time stayed up, and that was Maurice and Louis. Now, the two oldest boys, John, who was 23, and George Jr., who was 16, had spent the whole day working with their fathers, and they and their father had already went to sleep. Getting ready to go to bed, the phone rings at 12:30 a.m., and when Jenny answered it, an unfamiliar voice asked for someone who didn't live there. And Jenny told the person that they had the wrong number, and before Jenny could hang up the phone, she heard a lot of ruckus, laughter, glass clanging in the background as if someone was having a party. Now, tiptoeing her way back up to bed, she noticed that all the downstairs lights were on, all the curtains were open, and the front door was unlocked. She looked over to the couch and seen Marion asleep, and she just assumed that all the other kids were upstairs in bed. So she turns off all the lights, closes all the curtains, locks all the doors, and returns to her room to go to bed. And when she had began to doze off, she heard a sharp, loud bang on a roof and then a rolling noise. Not thinking nothing of it, Jenny just went back to sleep. And about a half an hour later, she woke up, but this time her room was filled with smoke. Now, quickly dashing out of her room, she noticed that George's office was on fire around the telephone line and the fuse box. And trying to get as many people as she could, she first runs into George and her two older sons, and she wakes them up. And she rushes outside and hopes to see the rest of her family. Those who seem to have escaped the fire was George, Jenny, Marion, John, George Jr., and Marion were holding the 2-year-old Sylvia. But unaccounted for was Maurice, Martha, Louis, Betty, and Jenny. George figured that the rest of the kids had to be upstairs in the bedrooms on either side of the hallway that was separated by a staircase. But that staircase was now engulfed in flames. So George quickly ran to the side of the house where they kept the ladder, hoping to get into the kids' bedrooms upstairs. But somehow, some way, this ladder that they always kept by the side of their house was missing. And so he thought that he could just drive one of his two coal trucks to the house and try to climb and reach the windows. But even though they were working and running perfectly the day before, neither of them would start now. Then he tried to use water from a nearby rain barrel, but it was the middle of the winter and it was frozen solid. And at this time, Marion sprinted to the neighbor's home to call the Fayetteville's fire department, but she got no response. Now, another neighbor who saw the fire made a call to the nearby tavern, but that neighbor got no response. Then the same neighbor drove to the firehouse and tracked down the fire chief who initiated Fayetteville's version of a fire alarm. Even though the fire station was less than 2 miles away, the fire department didn't get to the house until 8 a.m. And by that time, the home or that house was nothing but ash. And now looking at what they used to call home with no one else in sight except for neighbors, a useless fire department, George, Jenny, and the rest of the children just assumed the other 5 were dead. Fire Chief F.J. Morris said that the fire department was low on manpower due to the war, and they relied on individual firefighters to call each other as a next man up type of system. And he also said that he was unable to drive the fire truck and had to wait for someone who could drive the fire truck, and that person was only available to work in the morning. And at 10 a.m., Morris told the Sutter family that they had not found any bodies or bones and instructed George and his family to just leave the site undisturbed so that the fire marshals could conduct a more thorough investigation. And according to other accounts, they did find a few bone fragments and internal organs, but they chose not to tell the family. Now, nevertheless, Morris believed, or he just told George and Jenny, that the 5 children unaccounted for had indeed died in the fire, and just suggested that the fire was hot enough to burn the bodies completely. And not being able to look at the house their kids supposedly died in, George and Jenny had the basement covered with 5 feet of dirt and intended to preserve it as a memorial site. The local coroner convened an inquest the next day, which held that the fire was an accident caused by faulty wiring. If you don't know, an inquest is just a judicial inquiry on the facts of the incident, like the cause of death. And an inquiry is conducted by a judge, jury, and a government official. And among one of those jurors was the man who threatened George that his house would be burned down and his kids would be destroyed. There were 5 death certificates that were issued December 30th, and everyone except for George and Jenny attended the funeral on January 2nd, 1946. Now, the Sutter family started to stitch together the series of odd events and moments leading up to the fire. Now, George couldn't let go of the fact that the electric company told him that everything was safe, and how could that be the cause of the fire? And they also found the ladder that they kept on side of the house 75 feet away. A telephone repairman told the Sutter family that the house phone line had not been burned, but it had been cut. And that person had to be willing to climb up 14 feet and then reach out 2 feet away just to do so. Another man who some neighbors seen stealing a block and tackle from a property around the same time of the fire was identified and arrested. And he did admit to the theft and claimed that he had been the one to cut the phone line, but he thought it was the power line, and denied having anything to do with the fire. Now, Jenny said in an interview in 1968 that if he had indeed cut the power line, that her husband, and the rest of her kids wouldn't have made it out that house alive. Jenny also had trouble accepting Morris's belief that all the traces of the children had been burned completely in the fire. So she compared the results of her fire to a similar house fire that happened around the same time, which killed a family of 7, and it was reported that all the skeletal remains had been found. Jenny then burned a small pile of animal bones just to see if they would be consumed completely, and none of them were. So immediately after that, she contacted an employee at a local crematorium, and that person told her that a human body can remain intact if the bodies were burned at 2000 degrees Fahrenheit up to 2 hours. And that was far hotter and longer than her house could have ever been. So undeterred, George and Jenny put up the billboard on Route 16 and started to hand out $5,000 flyers for any information regarding the recovery of their children. But no one came forward, and then they soon increased the amount to $10,000. And it was at this point that the influx of reports of sightings began. Now, one woman claimed that she has seen the children looking from a passing vehicle while the fire was in progress. And the second woman, operating a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston, about 50 miles west, said that she saw the children the morning after the fire, saying that she served them for breakfast and the car that they were in had Florida license plates. And a third woman at a Charleston hotel said that she saw the children's photo in a newspaper, and she said that she seen 4 out of the 5 children that week after the fire. She goes on to say that the children was accompanied by 2 women, 2 men, and she assumed that they were Italian. Now, she couldn't remember the exact date. However, the entire party did register at that hotel and stayed in a large room with several beds. After they registered about midnight, she did try to talk to the children, but the men appeared to be hostile and refused to allow her to talk to the kids. And then one of the men looked at her aggressively and turned around and began to talking rapidly in Italian. And immediately after the chat, the whole party just stopped talking to her. And she sensed that she was just being froze out, so she said nothing and just moved on. Lastly, she would say that the party would leave early the next morning. Now, unable to get any help from the FBI, George hired a private investigator named C.C. Timsley, and he was the one who discovered that the insurance salesman who had threatened George was indeed a member of the coroner's jury who deemed that the fire was an accident. And Tinsley also heard a curious story from a Fayetteville minister that F.J. Morris, the fire chief, had found a heart but later placed it in a metal box and buried it at the fire site. Now, needing to know if this rumor were true, George and Tinsley went to Morris and they persuaded him to confess and show them where he had buried the box. And together they went and dug up the box and they took it straight to the local coroner, who poked and prodded at the heart and concluded that it was beef liver, untouched by the fire. And soon afterwards, the Sauter family heard rumors that the fire chief buried the beef in the rubble in hopes that they would find it and it would give them some type of solace and they would just call off the investigation. And some time would go by and they would hear bits and pieces like their daughter Martha was a convent in St. Louis. Now, the motel operator who claimed to have seen the children right after the fire saw a picture of a young girl from New York, and she said she looked like Betty. And not leaving anything up to chance, George and Jenny drove to see the young girl, but they were turned away by the young girl's parents. And in August 1949, the Sauter family just decided to have a new search of the fire, which they uncovered several small objects like damaged coins, a partially burned dictionary, and several shards of vertebrae. Now, the vertebrae showed no evidence that it had been exposed to any type of fire. And the reports also said that it was strange that no bones had been found if there were bodies left in that home. The reports also concluded that the vertebrae were most likely parts of the supply of dirt that George used to fill the basement to create the memorial. And in 1968, more than 20 years after the fire, Jenny went to the mailbox and she found an envelope addressed only to her. And it was postmarked in Kentucky but had no return address. And the inside was a photo of a man in his mid-20s, and on the flip side had a cryptic handwritten note, and it said, "Louis Sauter, I love my brother Frankie." And she and George couldn't deny the resemblance to their Louis, who were then 9 at the time of the fire. And beyond the obvious similarities of, the dark curly hair and the dark brown eyes, they had the same straight, strong nose and the same upward tilt in their eyebrow. Now, once again, they hired a private detective and they sent him to Kentucky, but he never contacted or they never heard from him again. Later in 1969, George would pass on, but Janie and the surviving children would continue to seek for answers about the missing children and their missing brothers and sisters. But John, however, never talked about that night of the fire except just to tell his family that they should accept what happened and move on with their lives. And for Jenny, the rest of her life since George passed, she would wear black in mourning and she tended the guarding at the memorial site at her former home. And after she died in 1989, the family finally took the billboard that housed the faces of their siblings for more than 40 years down. But if you guys like this type of storytelling, like this type of content, like I say all the time, it's probably only my second or third video. It doesn't matter. I have more coming. There's a lot out here. It's a lot. So stay tuned, stay posted, like, comment, subscribe, notifications, all that. And until next time, who did what? Who did it? I want to know who did it. Like, I ain't nosy like that, but I want to know who did it. Who did what?